The morning mist clung to the Utah mountains like a widow's veil. Thin and gray against the awakening sky, spring had come reluctantly to the valley in 1884, leaving patches of stubborn snow in the shadows of pine trees and along the northern slopes where the sun's fingers couldn't quite reach. The air carried that peculiar sharpness of mountain mornings, clean, cold, and somehow lonely. Thatcher Kane stood on his porch, coffee mug steaming in his calloused hands, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. At 40, he wore his solitude like a second skin, comfortable in its familiarity, yet heavy as wet wool. His face, weathered by wind and sun, bore the map of a man who had traveled far without ever leaving the valley. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, carved by years of keeping words inside rather than letting them out. The ranch sprawled before him, 200 acres of grazing land bordered by wild forest and mountain streams. It wasn't much compared to the big outfits down in Salt Lake Valley, but it was his. Every fence post, every outbuilding, every improvement bore the mark of his own hands. 15 years he'd worked this land alone. 15 years since Margaret's fever had taken her and left him with nothing but memories and the echoes of what might have been. He didn't think about women anymore, or at least that's what he told himself during the long days of mending fences and the longer nights of staring into the fire. The folks in Millwater, 20 miles east, had long since stopped their matchmaking attempts. That Kane fellow, they'd say, shaking their heads. Might as well be a monk up there in his mountains. The cattle were already stirring in the lower pasture, their breath creating small clouds in the cold air. Thatcher finished his coffee in one long swallow and set about the morning chores with the mechanical precision of a man who'd done the same tasks thousands of times. Feeding the horses, checking the water troughs, inspecting the fence line where the wolves had been testing it lately. Every movement was purposeful, economical, designed to fill the hours until exhaustion would grant him dreamless sleep. It was near noon when he saw the dust cloud rising from the wagon road. Visitors were rare enough to be remarkable. The last had been Jake Monroe 3 weeks ago, come to buy a bull. Thatcher squinted against the sun, trying to make out the approaching figure. Not a wagon this time, but a single person on foot, moving with the uncertain gait of someone near the end of their strength. He set down the harness he'd been repairing and walked toward the road, curiosity overcoming his usual reluctance for company. As the figure drew closer, he felt his stomach tighten with an unfamiliar sensation, not quite fear, not quite anticipation, but something that made him want to turn back to the safety of his barn. It was a woman. She wore a traveling dress of brown wool, now gray with dust, and carried a single carpet bag that seemed to grow heavier with each step. Her bonnet had slipped back, revealing hair the color of autumn leaves, not quite red, not quite brown, but something in between that caught the light like burnished copper. When she lifted her head and saw him, she stopped, swaying slightly like a young tree in the wind. Mr. Thatcher Kane. Her voice was hoarse with exhaustion, but steady beneath the weariness. He nodded slowly, not trusting his own voice. When was the last time a woman had spoken his name? Years. Many years. Thank the Lord, she breathed, and then her knees buckled. Thatcher moved without thinking, catching her before she hit the ground. She was lighter than he expected, bird-boned beneath the heavy wool. Her face, pale with fatigue, was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25, maybe 30. Fine lines around her eyes suggested laughter, though none graced her face now. "Water," she whispered faintly. He half carried, half walked her to the porch, settling her in the old rocking chair Margaret had once loved. His hands shook as he pumped water from the well, cursing himself for the weakness. "She's just a lost traveler," he told himself. "Nothing more. Nothing to do with me." She drank greedily, color slowly returning to her cheeks. When she'd emptied the cup twice, she leaned back and gave him a small, weary smile that was equal parts exhaustion and triumph. "I've come such a long way," she said. 3 days on the train, then the stage to Millwater, then walking since dawn when the driver said he wouldn't go any further into the mountains. She reached into her bag with trembling fingers and withdrew an envelope. "But I'm here now. I'm Eloise Mercer, Mr. Kane, your bride." The words hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, shaking his head. "There's some mistake, miss. I didn't send for any bride." Her smile faltered. "But the letter you wrote to the agency in Chicago said you needed a wife, someone strong enough for mountain living, not afraid of hard work." She held out the envelope with desperate certainty. "It's all here, your letter, your directions, your signature." Thatcher took the paper with numb fingers. His own name stared back at him from the bottom of the page. But the words above it were foreign, the handwriting not his own. Someone had written to a matrimonial agency in his name, promised marriage to this woman, even given detailed directions to his ranch. "This isn't my hand," he said quietly. "I never wrote this." The color drained from her face again. She stared at him, then at the letter, then back at his face, as if searching for some sign of deception. But I left everything," she whispered. "I traveled 2,000 miles. I have nowhere else to go." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the pines. Thatcher could see the moment the full weight of her situation settled on her shoulders. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted, but her hands trembled as she smoothed her dusty skirts. "I see," she said at last with careful dignity. "Then I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Kane. If you could perhaps direct me back to town." "It's 20 miles," he said automatically, "and there's weather coming." Indeed, clouds were already gathering over the western peaks, the kind that brought spring storms, rain in the valley, snow in the high places. "You won't make it before dark." "Then I'd best start walking." She reached for her carpetbag, her movements unsteady but resolute. "You won't make it," he repeated, harsher than he intended. "Not in your condition. Not with a storm coming." She turned to face him fully then, and he saw something in her eyes that made him think of a wounded animal, proud, desperate, dangerous in its pain. "Then, what would you have me do, Mr. Kane? Camp on your doorstep like a beggar?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he thought he'd outgrown. "The safe thing, the smart thing, would be to hitch up the wagon and drive her back to town himself, let her be someone else's problem." He'd built his solitary life carefully, brick by brick, and he had no intention of letting some strange woman with a forged letter tear it down. But looking at her, standing there, chin high despite her exhaustion, clutching that carpetbag like it held everything she owned in the world, which it probably did, he heard himself saying words he immediately regretted. "You can stay the night. Just tonight. The storm will pass by morning, and I'll take you to town myself." Relief flickered across her face before she hid it behind politeness. "That's very kind, Mr. Kane. I'll work for my keep, of course. I'm not afraid of hard work." He almost smiled at that. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said gruffly. "Was meant for a housekeeper back when—" He stopped short, unwilling to finish the sentence. "It's clean. You can rest there." As he led her inside, Thatcher tried not to notice how the afternoon light caught in her hair, or how her presence seemed to fill spaces that had been empty so long he'd forgotten they were hollow. The house suddenly felt different with her in it, smaller somehow, yet more alive. The sensation unsettled him deeply. He showed her to the small room, barely more than a closet with a narrow bed and a washstand. She set her carpetbag down carefully and turned to him with those eyes that seemed to see too much. "Who do you think wrote the letter, if not you?" He shrugged, uncomfortable with speculation, and even more uncomfortable with her nearness in the small space. "Could be anyone's idea of a joke. Doesn't matter now." "It matters to me," she said softly. "Someone wanted me to come here. Someone thought you needed—" She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. "I don't need anything," he said roughly. "I'll bring water for washing. Supper's at 6. He left before she could respond, fleeing to the familiar sanctuary of his barn. But even there, surrounded by the comforting smells of hay and horses, he couldn't shake the image of her standing in his house, looking like she belonged there. And for the first time in 15 years, Thatcher Kane wasn't sure solitude was enough. The storm rolled in fast. By sunset, the sky had turned to pewter and the wind howled down the valley, driving sheets of rain against the windows. Thatcher moved through the evening chores with a grim sort of focus, trying not to think about the woman sitting by his kitchen stove. Every time the wind rattled the shutters, he found himself glancing toward the house, half expecting her to vanish like some fevered dream. When he finally went inside, the scent of baking bread hit him first, warm, rich, alive. The table was set with dishes he hadn't used in years, and the old stove glowed with steady heat. Eloise Mercer, somehow restored from the weary stranger of that afternoon, stood at the stove stirring a pot. She had changed into a plain blue dress, her copper hair pinned up neatly. The firelight turned it into something close to gold. "I hope you don't mind," she said without turning. "I found supplies in your pantry. It seemed the least I could do." Thatcher stopped in the doorway, feeling like a trespasser in his own house. The smell of food, the clink of dishes, the soft hum of her voice. All of it awakened memories he'd buried deep. They ate mostly in silence, the storm their only conversation. Now and then, he caught her glancing at him, cautious but curious. When their eyes met, she looked away quickly, pretending to study the stew. After supper, she rose to clear the table. "You work from dawn to dark, Mr. Kane. You should rest." "I can see to the dishes." He wanted to protest, out of habit more than pride, but she moved with such quiet assurance that he found himself sinking into the chair by the fire instead. He watched her work, the rhythm of her movements calm and steady, like she'd been part of this house all along. When she finished, she stood in the doorway between kitchen and parlor, uncertain for the first time since he'd met her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the shelter. For everything." "It's not kindness," he said, needing to keep his distance. "Just decency." "No," she said, meeting his eyes. "It's more than that." Most men wouldn't have bothered. Quote, something in her tone, gentle but sure, cut through him like wind through pine. He opened his mouth to reply, but she was already turning toward her room. "Good night, Mr. Kane." "Good night, Miss Mercer." The house felt too quiet after she closed the door. The storm outside was fierce, but the real storm, Thatcher realized, was the one inside his chest. For 15 years he'd lived with silence as his only companion. Now the simple sound of a woman breathing in the next room unsettled him more than thunder ever could. He told himself he'd take her to town at first light, that by tomorrow afternoon she'd be someone else's problem. But when morning came, the rain hadn't stopped. The valley was a sea of mud, the road impassable. Thatcher stood by the window, coffee cooling in his hands. Behind him, he could hear Eloise moving quietly in the kitchen, the scrape of a chair, the gentle clatter of pans. Domestic sounds, familiar yet strange in his house. "I can try walking if you need me gone," she said from the doorway. "You'd be dead before you reached the first mile marker," he said without turning. "Roads washed out." "Then I'll work for my keep," she replied. "I won't be a burden." He finally looked at her then. Her hair was pinned up severely, her dress simple, her hands already red from washing dishes in lye soap. She was trying to make herself useful, to belong. It made something tight in his chest loosen, and at the same time, it frightened him. "Suit yourself," he said curtly, setting his cup down too hard. She studied him quietly. "You don't talk much, do you? Nothing worth saying." "Maybe," she said softly, "you just forgot how." That night, the rain turned to sleet, drumming steady against the roof. Thatcher found her again by the fire after supper, mending one of his old shirts with small, precise stitches. "You don't have to do that," he said gruffly. "I like to keep busy." She didn't look up. Idle hands make for restless thoughts. He hesitated, then sat across from her. "Where were you before all this?" "Before the letter?" "In Chicago, working at a boarding house." Her voice stayed even, but he caught the strain beneath it. It wasn't the kind of place a woman wanted to stay long. Too many men with rough manners, too few laws to protect you. He said nothing, but the words painted a picture he didn't like. A woman alone in a city full of wolves. "That's why I answered the letter," she continued quietly. "I thought coming west might give me a chance at something better." Her eyes lifted to his, and for a moment, the firelight flickered between them like truth made visible. "You got a cruel joke instead," he said. She gave a small, weary smile. Maybe not. Maybe a strange kind of mercy. He frowned. You call being stranded here mercy? You could have turned me away, she said, simply. You didn't. That silenced him. For the rest of the night, they sat in the quiet glow of the fire, each pretending not to watch the other. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something fragile had begun to thaw. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Thatcher woke to the smell of biscuits and coffee. Eloise had been up for hours. She greeted him with a small smile that almost made him forget how to speak. "Breakfast," she said, sliding a plate toward him. "You don't have to do this every day," he muttered. "I know," she replied, "but I want to." He studied her as he ate. She had rolled her sleeves up to the elbows, revealing pale skin marked with faint scars, evidence of years of work and survival. Her face was still tired, but there was strength in it too. After breakfast, Thatcher went out to check the livestock. When he returned, he found her standing by the kitchen window, staring at the letter again. "This handwriting," she said slowly. "It's not just forged. It's familiar." He stepped closer. "What do you mean?" "The paper. It's from the Millwater General Store. See the faint watermark?" She pointed to the corner. "Someone local wrote this. Someone who knows you." Thatcher's jaw tightened. "Jake," he muttered. "Jake Monroe. He was here a few weeks ago." Her eyebrows rose. "Your friend?" "Used to be." "Then maybe he thought he was helping you." "By lying?" She met his glare calmly. "By giving you a chance to start living again." He turned away, anger flaring hot and fast. "You don't know anything about me." "No," she said, "but I know what it looks like when someone stops living. I saw it in your eyes the first moment I met you." Thatcher said nothing. The truth of her words landed too close to the bone. That evening the fire burned low, and the wind moaned around the corners of the house. Eloise sat near the hearth, her hair loose for the first time, falling in soft waves down her back. Thatcher found himself unable to look away. She must have felt his gaze, because she turned, her eyes meeting his. "Tell me about her," she said gently. "About your wife." He froze. "Why?" "Because her ghost fills this house," Eloise said quietly. "And because I think you need to remember her as she was, not just as the loss you carry." He hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair opposite hers. The words came haltingly at first, then steadier. Margaret laughed at everything, even burned food. She said laughter was better than salt. It made anything bearable. She loved the spring. Said the world came alive again, same as the heart should. When he finished, Eloise's eyes were bright. "She sounds like someone worth loving." "She was," he said softly. "I just didn't expect to ever." He stopped himself, but the unfinished thought hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Outside, thunder rolled through the mountains. Eloise stood and crossed to the window, watching the lightning flash over the valley. "Storm's moving east," she said. "Tomorrow, the roads will clear." He nodded slowly. "I'll take you to town." She turned, her face unreadable. "If that's what you want." He didn't answer. He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. The storm broke again, fiercer than before. They sat in silence, the firelight flickering between them. Two souls caught between past and future, between solitude and something dangerously close to hope. Outside, the thunder faded into rain. Inside, Thatcher Kane realized that the hardest storms were not the ones that came from the sky, but the ones that came from within. The storm passed by morning, leaving the valley washed clean and quiet. Mist rose from the fields like smoke, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. Thatcher stood at the window, watching sunlight spill over the ridges. Behind him, Eloise moved softly through the kitchen, humming under her breath as she poured coffee. The sound settled somewhere deep inside him, a place that had been silent for far too long. He told himself again that he'd drive her to town today. That was the plan. That was what made sense. But as the morning stretched on, he found excuse after excuse to delay. The wagon needed checking. The creek might still be high. The horses were restless after the storm. All true, but none of them the real reason. When Eloise appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, he didn't need her to ask. She already knew. "The road's clear enough," she said quietly. "You could take me now." "I could," he admitted, "but I won't." "Not yet." Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, hope, maybe both. She sat down across from him. "Why?" Quote, he looked at her, really looked at her, the determination in her chin, the kindness in her eyes, the way her presence made his empty house feel like home again. "Because I don't want to." For a long time, neither spoke. Outside, a hawk circled above the fields. The wind whispered through the pines. Then Eloise said softly, "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Kane." "Thatcher," he corrected. "You should call me Thatcher." Her lips curved in a small smile. "All right, Thatcher, but you don't owe me anything." "Maybe not," he said. "But maybe I want to." That afternoon, while she worked in the garden she'd started beside the porch, Thatcher saddled his horse and rode into Millwater. Jake Monroe was stacking feed sacks behind the general store when he saw him coming. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake said. "Did the mountains finally spit you out?" Quote, Thatcher dismounted slowly, his face unreadable. "We need to talk." Jake nodded toward the back room. "Figured you'd come around sooner or later." Inside, Thatcher set the forged letter on the counter between them. "You wrote it." Quote, Jake sighed. "I did." "Why?" Jake leaned on the counter, meeting his friend's eyes. "Because you've been dead inside for 15 years, Thatcher. I got tired of watching it. You wouldn't come to town, wouldn't see people, wouldn't live. So I sent for someone who might wake you up. You had no right." "Maybe not," Jake said evenly, "but tell me I was wrong." Thatcher's jaw clenched. "You lied to her. You tricked her." "And yet she stayed," Jake said softly. "Ask yourself why." Thatcher had no answer. Anger warred with gratitude inside him, twisting like barbed wire. He finally said, "If she'd been hurt because of your foolishness." "But she wasn't," Jake interrupted. "And from the look in your eyes, I'd say you're the one who's been healed." Thatcher stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're a damn fool, Jake." Jake smiled faintly. "Takes one to know one." By the time Thatcher rode back to the ranch, the sun was dipping low, painting the valley in gold. Eloise was on the porch, her skirt hem damp with dirt, her hands streaked with soil. When she saw him, she wiped her hands and stood. "You went to town," she said. "I did." "And?" He took a deep breath. "Jake wrote the letter." "I thought so," she said quietly. "He said he did it to help me, to help us." She studied his face. "And what do you think?" Quote, "I think," he said slowly, "that he was right." She looked startled, then cautious. "Right?" Thatcher stepped closer, close enough to see the freckles the sun had brought out across her nose. "You came here by mistake, Eloise, but I'm starting to think it wasn't a mistake at all." Her eyes softened, but she shook her head slightly. "You don't have to say that. You've been kind. That's enough." "It's not kindness," he said. "It's truth. You've changed this place. Changed me. For 15 years, I thought living meant surviving. You reminded me it's more than that." The silence that followed was thick with everything neither had said. Then Eloise whispered, "Thatcher, what happens now?" He took her hands in his, rough, warm, steady. "Now I ask you to stay." Her breath caught. "As your housekeeper?" Quote, "No." He smiled faintly. "As my wife." The tears that filled her eyes were bright as morning dew. "Are you sure?" Quote, he nodded. "For the first time in years, I'm sure of something. I don't want to go back to a house filled with ghosts when I could have one filled with laughter. I don't want silence when I could have your voice." Eloise pressed a hand to her mouth, her shoulders trembling. "You mean it?" "Every word." When she finally lowered her hand, her smile was small but radiant. "Then yes," she said simply. "Yes, Thatcher Kane, I'll stay." The setting sun broke through the clouds, flooding the porch with golden light. He reached for her then, hesitantly at first, but when she stepped closer, he gathered her into his arms. It was the first time he'd held a woman in 15 years, and it felt both strange and entirely right. She fit against him, as if she'd been meant to be there all along. Weeks later, the people of Millwater gathered in the small white church to watch them marry. Reverend Daniel spoke of grace and second chances. Jake stood at Thatcher's side, grinning like a man who'd won a wager. Eloise's dress was simple but elegant, her copper hair shining in the morning light. When Thatcher slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands didn't shake. Outside, the mountains stood witness. The air was clear, the sky impossibly blue. That night, after the guests had gone and the house had grown quiet, Thatcher sat with Eloise by the fire. Her head rested against his shoulder, their fingers twined. The warmth between them was no longer tentative. It was home. "I keep thinking," Eloise said softly, "if not for that letter." He smiled. "If not for that letter, I'd still be a ghost. And you'd still be searching for a place to belong. So perhaps it wasn't a mistake after all." "No," he said, kissing her forehead gently. It was Providence wearing a clever disguise. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, soft and steady. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now pulsed with life. The sound of two hearts rediscovering what it meant to love, to hope, to live again. The ranch that had been silent for 15 years now had laughter, footsteps, and warmth in its walls. And Thatcher Kane, the lonely rancher who hadn't touched a woman in half his lifetime, finally found peace. Not in forgetting the past, but in learning that love can return even to those who had stopped believing in it.